and welcome to America Unfiltered with me, your host, Ellie Cohanim in New York, where we'll be discussing the stories shaping America and reshaping the world. From national debates to global affairs, we'll be looking at the stories making headlines right now. Let's get started. This week, my guest is Josh Hammer, Senior Editor-at-Large for Newsweek, Senior Counsel for the Article 3 Project, and host of The Josh Hammer Show. Josh, you've been a leading voice in the conservative movement. You were a good friend of Charlie Kirk's. From what I understand, you were in touch on an almost daily basis. Can you share with us your assessment of where the conservative movement is now in the aftermath of Charlie's assassination?
Well, Ellie, happy to answer that. First of all, just want to say it's great to be with you on your brand new show, and wishing you a hearty congratulations on this wonderful new show as well. I hope that it is extraordinarily successful. So Charlie was a friend of mine, much as you are a friend as well, Ellie. And Charlie and I had gotten closer over the final year and a half or so, give or take, of his life. And it's true, we actually were in touch as recently as less than 24 hours prior to his tragic assassination on September 10th. In fact, the night before, he actually had organized a Zoom call with me, with Rabbi Pesach Wilicki, and a couple others, just trying to talk through strategies for his forthcoming campus tour, especially when it comes to trying to combat hatred of Jews and anti-Israel animus and so forth on college campuses. So we were in touch, and his loss is a monumental one, and it is one that we are still feeling. And to your question, is actually not at all a coincidence in my mind that you've now seen the floodgates of all of some just utterly horrific, seething hatred and animus that has burst through the floodgates in the aftermath of Charlie's assassination. In hindsight, it seems pretty obvious, and some of us recognize this while he was still alive, but it should be deeply obvious to those now in hindsight, if it wasn't at the time, that Charlie really was the glue holding a lot of the American right together, that in many ways he and his organization were the dam holding up a lot of the floodgates of some really nasty and dark stuff. So in the tragic aftermath of Charlie now, I think you're seeing a lot of individuals who are cynically trying to jockey for market share and trying to exploit his death to try to hijack the movement, to try to take in a particularly dark or conspiratorial direction. And a lot of it is fairly ugly. No one knows that, Ellie, more than me, especially after Candace Owens accused me of having foreknowledge and therefore complicity in Charlie's assassination, and an utterly mentally insane thing to say that once upon a time would have been fit for a lunatic asylum in this country. But following that, Ellie, I mean, I can't even tweet "the sky is blue" without getting a flood of Nazis in the replies of my social media feed. So it's nasty. Some of it happens, I think, to be bought, foreign funded. It actually was a brand new study just this week from the NCRA, the Network Contagion Research Institute, showing that a lot of Nick Fuentes' social media traction seems to come from foreign bot farms in places like Pakistan and Nigeria and so forth. But some of it is organic, some of it is real. And there are real divides. Not all of it is foreign. There are indeed some very real divides. And those of us who are on the pro-Western civilization side of this argument have our hands full right now, because we are dealing with a lot of folks who think of themselves perhaps as being of, for, and by the right, but they're really not. They're actually of, for, and by team barbarism, not team civilization, as Charlie would have phrased it. So Ellie, we got to do the best we can on a day in, day out basis there. I'm fighting the good fight. I know that you are as well, and God willing, we will prevail in this.
Yeah, and Josh, you brought a lot to this particular subject right now. I'd love to break it down a little bit for the audience. Specifically, you mentioned Candace Owens launching personal attacks against you, and figures like Nick Fuentes and Tucker Carlson. A lot of people are saying that they're noticing real anti-Semitism coming from these personalities and others who are identified with the right wing of the political spectrum in the United States. So what's your take on what's happening right now with these figures, and where does it leave Republicans as they get ready for the midterms and the 2028 presidential election?
Well, these folks are saying invariably really, really awful things. And once upon a time, Ellie, the American right was constituted such that there was not room for this sort of talk. And I think what I can identify, Ellie, if I'm being most charitable, if I'm trying to be most charitable here, some folks actually seem to have animus, whether it's Jew hatred or just racism or misogyny, in their bones. I have no doubt that at this point Tucker Carlson actually really hates Jewish people. I have no doubt that Candace Owens hates Jewish people. But when it comes to some of the apologists for quote unquote platforming these individuals there, the most charitable way that I can possibly put it is that you have some folks who are looking at the big tech censorship fights from 2017, 2018, 2019, including 2020 and the very controversial election that we had here in the U.S. I think a lot of folks are looking at that and now they're running to the complete opposite end where they have such PTSD, they have such trauma from all the big tech censorship fights that now they just say, okay, it doesn't matter what he's saying, just platform. But there's a difference between saying that someone has a First Amendment legal right to voice opinions, or perhaps even that you have a moral right to access a certain venue, such as Rumble, which bills itself as an all-out free speech website, maybe even YouTube. It's very different to say that you have either a legal right or a personal, civil, or moral right to access a certain platform and to spew your bile. That's different than saying that person and his or her opinions are welcome as part of the coalition, are welcome as part of the fold. Those are not the same thing. And I think a lot of folks are deeply conflating it. Just because someone vaguely codes him or herself as being on the right does not mean that person is actually on the right in a big alliance, a building block, coalition sense of the term. By the way, we've mentioned Charlie Kirk numerous times. Literally no one understood this greater than Charlie Kirk. There is no one that Charlie Kirk opposed more vociferously over the entire course of his career, over his tragically truncated career. There is not a single person who he more vehemently opposed than Nick Fuentes. He opposed Nick Fuentes louder and clearer and with a more fiery passion in his belly than any single figure on the left over the years. And because there's numerous reasons for that, but he saw in Nick Fuentes, who was a Holocaust-denying, deeply racist, an epic fool, just an epically foolish and horrible human being. He saw in him a threat to his own cause. He saw in him someone who would discredit the right, and therefore would have voters run away from the right towards the left because they wouldn't want to be associated for really at all with someone who is effectively a Nazi. Now, the conservative movement has had these battles. They've had these fights going back for many, many, many years. Many of us have heard the stories of a previous generation's battles back in the 1960s when it comes to the John Birch Society and things like that there. I don't think that we need to rehash this, but it's worth stipulating that if you are in the art of conserving something, Ellie, if you are involved in conserving something, which is literally what it means to be a conservative, you are attempting to conserve and preserve this civilizational cultural inheritance from one generation to the next in what Edmund Burke famously described as an intergenerational compact between the dead, the living, and the yet unborn. If that is what it means to be conservative, and that's what I think it means to be conservative, if that's what it means, then by definition, boundaries must be drawn. Because if you are paradoxically trying to conserve everything at the same time, aka platform everyone, ironically, you're actually conserving nothing at all.
And Josh, my last question on this topic, some people are pointing fingers at the national conservatism movement. Do you see any fault in that movement in where we are right now?
Ellie, look, I have been a part of the national conservatism movement since the start. I thought that it was an attempt to orient the American right in an intellectually healthy direction away from the liberal abstractions of yesteryear and trying to become a more tangible, practical vehicle to really help the men and women of this country. That is the reason that I was attracted to it. I also personally am a nationalist. I vehemently oppose universalism and globalism. I believe in the nation state. So there's been a lot to love about the National Conservatism Conference. I am concerned that the leaders of the movement have done an insufficient job in trying to patrol the boundaries of this particular coalition and trying to define what it is that the movement stands for and what it is that the movement does not stand for. Now, in fairness, going back to the very first conference we had back in Washington, D.C., back in 2019, I was there. At the time, I was covering it as a journalist. I wasn't even a speaker. I remember my friend David Bragg, one of the co-founders of the NACOM movement, saying very clearly in his speech that if you are a racist or white supremacist, there's the door, go see yourself out, you're not welcome here, period, full stop, end of story. So they've opposed racism, anti-Semitism, et cetera, since day one. But as the situation on the right has deteriorated, I think that the leaders of the movement have failed to police and patrol the boundaries and to orient this in a healthier direction there. So I was very personally disappointed in some of the speeches from the movement's leaders that I heard at the September 2025 conference, the one a few months ago that I personally spoke at there. And I would expect, Ellie, that I will be less involved with the movement going forward because I'm very disappointed with how the leaders have handled it. But that's not to say that there are not some good ideas there. There are, but it has failed to keep up with the current times, and the leaders have failed to keep it heading in a healthy and viable direction.
Well, so you're perhaps sharing some breaking news with us, and I hope that the leaders of the movement do take perhaps what you're sharing is a bit of a wake-up call to them. Josh, I want to move us on to a book that you've recently published titled Israel and Civilization, The Fate of the Jewish Nation and the Destiny of the West, which is described as, quote, a next-generation manifesto, declaring that the fate of Western civilization depends on the security and thriving of the Jewish people and the Jewish state of Israel. With that lens, Josh, how do you view the current Israel-Gaza negotiations?
Well, the current negotiations, Ellie, seem to me to really not be going anywhere in a hurry, which is something that I could have seen coming. I'm sure that you could have seen coming. Anyone who's been around the block and has followed Israel's recurring invariable fights against radical Islamist jihadists. I mean, anyone who's followed this for years now could, I think, have easily seen coming that Hamas is not going to simply just lay down their arms and disarm, as the Trump administration's 20-ish point peace plan called for. And the reason that they're not going to do so is actually very, very simple. It's literally in their charter. They can't do it. They are ideologically committed to not laying down their arms. There was actually just an exchange that the wretched Anna Kasparian, Cenk Uyghur's sparring partner or his teammate, Anna Kasparian, was on Bill Maher's show and Bill Maher said, oh, Hamas will just keep on trying to kill Israel. And Kasparian says, well, how do you know that, Bill? And he says, well, it's literally in their charter. Because it is. Hamas does not mince words, Ellie. This stuff's actually publicly accessible. A lot of folks who have not Googled it, you should really just go ahead and Google it. It's available via the Yale Law School library. You can go and literally read the Hamas founding charter. It's from the late 1980s, 1987, 1988, right around there. They say that they aim to kill all the Jews of Israel. And by the way, they want to kill all the Jews around the world. And as if that's not good enough, their actual goal is to kill all so-called infidels, which is all Christians as well, and frankly, a lot of Muslims as well, really all Muslims who do not subscribe to their uniquely toxic brand of Sharia supremacist ideology. So these are just a horrific batch of 7th century aspiring Sharia supremacist radicals, and they're not going to lay down their arms anytime soon because they can't, because their entire life's purpose is to not lay down their arms. And anyone who is not a fool, I think, should have seen this coming. It's one of the reasons that I was personally advocating so hard for Israel to finish this job quickly, to not let this drag out there before the overwhelming pressure and the diplomacy just kind of takes over there and there's no military action left. That's not exactly what happened. And this is just kind of the story of Israel's existence, isn't it? I mean, having these recurring problems in Gaza. The northern border that Israel has with Lebanon is suddenly a little hotter all of a sudden. It's nothing close to what it was as recently as 2 years ago, but it's still getting a little hotter than what it was last summer after the death of Hassan Nasrallah and other actors like that there. This is very much kind of just the story of Israel's existence. And to kind of take it back to the themes of my book, Israel and Civilization, if the United States and if Western civilization more generally cares about itself, it will recognize that this is a very stark moral and strategic dichotomy between a deeply important player in the region, the wellspring, the birthplace of Western civilization, also the canary in the coal mine when it comes to Islamist hegemony in the region. It will look at that on the one side, and then this Sharia supremacist 7th century aspiring jihadist death cult on the other side, and will say, just let them do their thing. So look, if the president, Jared Kushner, Steve Witkoff, if they want to continue to try to negotiate some sort of viable, sustainable way that this works out, that's fine. I have absolutely no objection to that in principle. I'm just saying in practice, Ellie, I don't understand how it could possibly work and how Hamas could just voluntarily lay down their arms. They are saying, by the way, the most recent thing I saw is that Hamas is now saying that they're open to possibly finding some warehouse to lay down their arms there. I will believe that when I see it. It kind of reminds me of the word hunna, which roughly translates, Westerners translate it typically as a ceasefire, but for jihadists, the notion of a hunna is actually not a true ceasefire in the Western English language sense of the term. It refers to kind of a strategic, momentarily cessation of hostilities to allow that group to rearm then for future hostilities. That's what's going on there, and I'll be skeptical, frankly, if it's anything other than that.
Well, and I think any honest observer of the Middle East knows that Hamas is a foreign terrorist organization. They're not going to be giving up their arms easily. But Josh, what that brings me to is your book and the notion that you argue that Israel is the tip of the spear for Western civilization, while at the same time we're seeing perhaps less and less support for Israel in the American public. How do those two trends work with each other, and what is your argument for why the U.S. should be continuing to support Israel?
Well, Ellie, the reason I think fewer Americans are supporting Israel today is because fewer Americans, frankly, support America today. There are fewer Americans who understand what it actually is to be an American in the first place, what it actually is that made this country, what made it great, and what will keep it great there. There's a reason that historically it's been a close correlation between optimism, approval ratings of the country, confidence in America's future, and support for Israel. So, for instance, after 9/11, which was just a horrific atrocity on September 11, 2001, in the year and a half-ish that followed, President Bush had astronomically high approval ratings. And people were very confident there because this is before his collapse, but at the time they viewed him as a very, very strong leader. And they were confident about America's future because we were going to go in and get the bad guys, get bin Laden, et cetera, et cetera. It's not a coincidence that around that time, that's when U.S. support for Israel completely skyrocketed. It was around the highest polling incidents or highest polling timelines of U.S. support for Israel, really in the post-1948 history of the modern Jewish state. And again, you see that now playing out as well, because Americans, based on all the polling that I see, are not particularly confident about the country. They're not particularly optimistic about the future, whether it comes to threats, foreign and domestic, whether it comes in the form of the Chinese Communist Party or Russia or Iran or whoever the case may be, or whether it comes in the form of domestic social maladies as well, when it comes to doom scrolling, addiction to Instagram and TikTok and our big tech oligarchs, whether it comes in the form of drugs, of horrific fentanyl overdoses and all of that there, despondency, loneliness. A lot of things are very much on the rise that are not indicative or conducive of a healthy society. We've also seen in recent decades precipitously declining rates of Americans who attend religious houses of worship, especially Christians who are simply not attending church or not describing themselves as Bible-believing Christians at a rate anywhere close to what was the norm in America for a very, very long time. So to me, it seems almost self-evident that support for Israel would decline amidst all of these particular trends. But Ellie, I've said for my entire adult lifetime, my entire political commentary career, that there's not a panacea, but if there's one thing that's as close to a panacea as possible, that's as close to a one-size-fits-all solution, if I could just snap my fingers and here's what I would do to solve the vast majority of America's social, economic, et cetera, all of our maladies there, it really would be to have a new religious awakening in this country. And that would solve so many of our worries. It would have people start dating again, get married again, start having children again there. They would find meaning and purpose there. They would shy away from drugs and various other vices there. And they also would make common cause with the American founders, who were a biblically literate, intimately biblically literate group of men. And they saw as deep inspiration for their project, for the founding of America, they saw as deep inspiration the ancient story of Israel and the Hebrew Bible more generally. It's not an accident that this group of pious, devout Christian men, at times they wanted to make the national seal of the United States Moses parting the Red Sea with the Israelites trailing behind. That was Benjamin Franklin's proposal. It's not an accident that you had men like John Adams, our second president, describe the Hebrews as the greatest civilization that ever lived because they introduced monotheism to the world. These two things are related. When you have more more God and scripture in your life. You're going to have a more, I think, intimately familiar relationship with the roots of all of that, which really kind of takes you back to support for Israel. So that is kind of one of the things that I most fervently hope for. I don't think that's necessary, by the way. I don't think it's necessary to support U.S.-Israel relations. You can absolutely support U.S.-Israel relations if you are an agnostic atheist. I don't think it particularly matters there. But just kind of looking at a broader whole, I think that would be the easiest way, frankly, not just to boost U.S.-Israel relations, but really just to boost America in general, would be to have some sort of religious awakening in this country.
Josh, that's really interesting what you're saying about religiosity, and it kind of ties back to our conversation about Charlie Kirk. His book that just came out that he was writing is about the Jewish Sabbath, and it's interesting to note that his mostly Christian audience is resonating so much with this idea of taking a day of rest that comes out of Judaism and the Jewish tradition. So I do hope that more people will read that book and also heed your call for that. But I'd love to now turn to another area of your expertise, which is the American legal tradition. Depending on who you ask regarding President Trump's immigration policies, it's either some of his most popular or most controversial. Meanwhile, just last week, the Supreme Court agreed to hear the case on birthright citizenship. Josh, can you walk us through the significance of that?
Sure. So this is one of Donald Trump's first executive orders that he issued on January 20th, 2025, where he is seeking to end birthright citizenship for the children, at least of illegal aliens, possibly for the children of certain types of legal aliens as well, but a minimum for children of illegal aliens. So, Ellie, the context before we dive in here is that America is one of only 30-ish countries in the world that has this policy, that has automatic citizenship for anyone who was born on our soil. Essentially, period, full stop, end of story. There are some exceptions if you are the son or daughter of a diplomat, of an ambassador, a consul general, et cetera, does not apply. But for the most part, America, Canada, we're two of the only 30 countries in the world. So we're already very much an outlier. Now, if you listen to how the media reports this, Ellie, they will often say, oh, the Supreme Court has long held that the 14th Amendment requires birthright citizenship for the children of legal aliens. No, it doesn't. No, it literally doesn't. How do I know? Because I've studied this very, very closely since law school. I have written and studied it at great length, actually. So the relevant legal language, we're talking here about Section 1, Clause 1 of the 14th Amendment of the U.S. Constitution, which says, and I'm paraphrasing, I'm not reading it verbatim, but it basically says, every person born in the United States and subject to the jurisdiction thereof shall be a citizen of the United States and of the state in which he or she was born. And the purpose of this clause, Ellie, taking us back to 1868 when this amendment was ratified, the purpose was to overturn a case called Dred Scott, which came out about a decade earlier, Dred Scott versus Sanford, the single most egregious case in the history of the United States Supreme Court, where they infamously held that it's appallingly racist, appallingly terrible legal logic. They said that black people were not and could not be citizens of the United States. So the clear intent of the citizenship clause of the 14th Amendment, which was 3 years after the end of the Civil War, was to make sure that black people were citizens, period. That's the entire point here. It had nothing to do with the children of illegal aliens, with the drug cartels, the traffickers. Now, the legal debate hinges upon how one interprets that qualifying phrase, subject to the jurisdiction thereof. So the pro-birthright citizenship for illegals crowd will say that subject to the jurisdiction thereof simply means that you're here, and you're subject to the jurisdiction because if you commit a crime, we will prosecute you for homicide. If you commit a tort, we can sue you for battery or for larceny or whatever the case may be there. But that doesn't actually add up, does it? Because it would be legally superfluous language. It's not actually necessary. It's obvious. You don't have to write that. It is obvious that if you are on soil and you commit a crime, you can be prosecuted unless you have some sort of bespoke diplomatic immunity that applies to literally everyone. So what does subject to the jurisdiction thereof actually mean? Fortunately, we actually know the answer to that, because if you look back and you look at the men who actually drafted the 14th Amendment, men like Senator Jacob Howard of Michigan, men like Senator Lyman Trumbull of Illinois, they say very clearly that the purpose was to constitutionalize, to grant an imprimatur of constitutional legitimacy retroactively to a statute that Congress passed 2 years prior called the Civil Rights Act of 1866. And that particular law speaks of instead of subject to the jurisdiction thereof, it says, and not subject to a foreign power. So now the light bulb's going off, because the actual meaning of subject to this jurisdiction means that you are not subject to a foreign power.
Josh, I'm going to jump in there and just ask, do you think it's possible the Supreme Court might overturn birthright citizenship?
Unfortunately, Ellie, I am not optimistic about this. I would love nothing more than to be wrong, because I think that it is a horrific public policy that incentivizes the cartels and the trafficking rings, encourages birth tourism, all sorts of other terrible things. It is a ludicrous policy. It should have ended a very long time ago, but I don't see it happening, unfortunately, when it comes to this current Supreme Court. I see maybe one or two votes, Clarence Thomas and Sam Alito. I think everyone else is a question mark. Maybe you get a Gorsuch, maybe a Kavanaugh. Honestly, if I had to predict, Ellie, I would be skeptical that you get any more than Clarence Thomas or Sam Alito. So unfortunately, I don't think that this argument is going to fly at the Supreme Court, which says nothing about, frankly, the legal merits of the Trump executive order, which is legally sound. It says everything, frankly, about the somewhat squishy nature of some of the Republican nominated justices at the Supreme Court. I very much hope to be wrong. I genuinely pray that I'm wrong. It's a very important policy, and America has to get it right. But unfortunately, I don't necessarily see it happening with the current court.
Josh, it's interesting because you're talking about Republicans on the Supreme Court, but I wanted to also ask you about Democrats who seem to be using the lower courts and the U.S. justice system to impede Trump's overall agenda, his immigration agenda. Do you think that Democrats are going to be successful? Are they going to be able to run the clock out on the Trump administration?
They might. They definitely might. So there was a case at the court last term called CASA, which was a fairly strong ruling, a 6-3 ruling, where they said that the notion of a so-called nationwide injunction, the notion that a lower court can just bring the entire government to a halt with just a lone single district court judge, that this flies in the face of the constitutional order and is offensive to a constitutional order. But they did leave some wiggle room. They did say that in very, very, very exceptional cases, blah, 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 ... maybe it might be appropriate. So there's that. There's also some other creative workarounds that some of these left-wing lower court judges have already been implementing to get around the CASA decision. So, for instance, they've been trying to certify a very large class of people when it comes to class action litigation under Rule 23 of the Civil Procedure Rules. That's been a longstanding point of debate between liberal and conservative justices. There's actually the late Justice Antonin Scalia, a strong conservative who was very opposed to this free-flowing liberal granting of massive class action certifications there. So there are some long-standing unresolved tensions when it comes to some of this, and these are some of the tools that the courts are still using to try to run out the clock, as you correctly put it. We'll see. Stronger action is ultimately needed. I want to see some impeachment articles filed. I want to see some judges impeached. Judge Boasberg in D.C. would be a very good candidate. I would like to see Congress pass jurisdiction stripping legislation, trying to strip federal jurisdiction from certain lower courts, possibly even trying to abolish some entire judgeships outright. That is their power under Article 1, Section 8 of the Constitution. So stronger remedies are currently called for at this time because, Ellie, you're absolutely right that unless those strong remedies come, frankly, ASAP, there is a real chance that the judicial insurrection could run out the clock on this administration.
Well, Josh, you and I have covered so much. Thank you for joining me.
Ellie, it's been an absolute pleasure. Congratulations again on the new show, and God bless you, my friend. I hope to see you very soon.
That's all we've got time for, Josh. Thanks so much for joining me and sharing your insights. You've been watching America Unfiltered with Ellie Cohanim from New York. Until next time, goodbye.